Hi there, I'm Marianne Taylor, also known as the House Detective, and this is this fortnight's top 5 finds, where I cover the top 5 most interesting, unusual or cool discoveries from my house history research. This fortnight was very strange. It was one of those times where I researched a number of different buildings and places, but they all had links to each other. First up, I'm going to be talking about quite a shameful aspect of Australian history and particularly Queensland history, and that is the use of South Sea Islander labour, particularly in connection with sugar plantations here in Queensland. Staying with the sugar theme, I'm going to show this fantastic book that came into my possession recently, and it contains views of Bundaberg, and there's a connection in that to the sugar plantations and the South Sea Islander labourers. Next up, I'll be telling you about this amazing house at Clayfield, designed by one of Brisbane's best known architects, and then that house has a connection to Wickham House on Wickham Terrace in Brisbane, and I'll be telling you more about the history of that remarkable building. Finally, I am going to just spoil you with a selection of incredible old photos of Wickham Terrace and that area, which I came across in the process of researching Wickham House, and they cover roughly a 100-year span from about the 1880s until the 1980s, and they include many of the buildings along that terrace, and they also capture a lot of the change in that area, which it'll blow your mind, so stick around for that one at the end. I hope you enjoy watching. I was recently researching a house at Clayfield, and one of the owners of the land that the house was later built on was Charles Ferdinand Marx. When I looked into his history, he was actually a medical practitioner, a doctor, and he'll come up again in number 3, I think it is, on today's video. And it turns out that he was actually the stepfather of 2 very well-known Brisbane identities, S.B. Dods and Robin Dods, and I'll talk a bit more about both of those gentlemen later on as well. As I said, all these stories are linked today. But Charles Marx was a doctor, and he, in addition to being a doctor, he also was a partner in the Ruby Anna Sugar Company. Now, as soon as I saw that written down, my thoughts immediately went to the practice that unfortunately often went hand in hand with these early sugar plantations. Sugar plantations would become notorious for the use of South Sea Islander labour. Now, this was a process called blackbirding, where these men, and it was mainly men and young boys, quite young boys in some cases, mainly from Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, but also a range of other islands. And they were basically, best case scenario, coaxed, convinced, talked into coming onto these blackbirding ships. Worst case scenario, straight out kidnapped from their homes and their families, loaded onto these ships, transported to Australia, mainly Queensland, and forced to undertake labour on these sugar plantations. These workers were known at the time as kanakas. This is a highly offensive term now that's no longer used. The terms varied. Some of the people were paid minimal wages, far less than any other workers. Some were paid in schemes, and this was true of First Nations and Australian workers as well. They were paid in tokens from the property that they were employed by, and they could only use these tokens at stores that were owned by the property, so effectively they had no free money of their own and they were trapped on this one site. This was also true of many First Nations people as well, who were forced to work and their wages were supposedly held in trust for them, or they were otherwise forced to work without immediate pay. Now, a lot of us would probably say that we never had slavery in Australia. Even Scott Morrison in 2020 declared that we didn't ever have slavery in this country. Now, I was probably one of many people that were screaming at the TV at this point and thinking, you know, you buffoon, read a history book for goodness sake. We definitely had slavery in Australia. However, it was often called different things, operated slightly differently to the type of slavery that went on in America on the cotton plantations. But do not be fooled by this. It was unpaid or minimal paid labour You were trapped there, you had no chance of escape, and you were completely under the control of the master of the plantation or whoever your overseer was. The first ship carrying these indentured labourers arrived in Queensland in 1863. Now this is remarkable because this is during the Civil War in America, which was broadly about fighting for and against slavery. Now that's a massive simplification and it's much more complicated than that, but slavery was at the heart of the Civil War. And in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, slavery was abolished. And we're just starting to introduce this in Australia as it's winding down in America. It had been largely outlawed in the British Empire by this date. This practice was not outlawed in Australia until 1901 and still continued up until about 1908. During the period that South Sea Islander labour was being brought to Australia, it's estimated that around 62,000 people came to Australia under those various guises, whether it was willingly, whether it was kidnapping, whether it was coercion. Now, that's a vast number and it's a bit hard to get your head around. So I want you to think about Suncorp Stadium, okay? That stadium holds about 52,500 people. So you think about how many people that is when that stadium is full. It was more people than that were taken from their homelands and forced to work as labourers on these plantations. Now that's just the official records. I imagine that is a very conservative number as it's an industry that was rife with breaking the law, and I'm sure there was plenty of undocumented workers that were brought here as well. So an astounding number of people. Thousands upon thousands of them died working the fields and many were buried in unmarked graves, and a lot of them still have not been uncovered to this day. So it's, as I mentioned, it's a shameful, dark, disturbing aspect of our history here in Australia, but it's also an important part of our history and our story, and I think we can't just focus on the positive things from our past. We need to acknowledge that bad things happen too. So I mentioned at the start that this also has a connection to the sugar industry in Queensland. It's an incredible book that has historical views of Bundaberg. I have a friend who often comes across old books, discarded books, and messages me if they're related to history because he knows what a history nerd and book lover I am. And that's what happened here. He sent me a photo of this one that he'd found in a skip. Who would throw this out? Disgraceful. So yeah, he sent me a photo of it, asked if I would be interested, and I was like, hell yes, I'm interested. So he posted it to me and I ended up insisting to pay him some money for it because I thought it was definitely worth it. Now, interestingly, we were trying to work out what date it would be, and there's actually an inscription in it, and it says, "To Mrs. Elizabeth Beckman from Lily Derby," and it is dated March 1898. That's right, 1898. So that gives us a reference point. It has to have been published, you would think, before 1898. And I'm not sure of the exact date, but it doesn't really matter because the images are fantastic. So they capture a range of buildings and landscapes around Bundaberg. But as I mentioned, the connection to the sugar plantations is that it actually captures images of workers on these plantations. So this incredible book, which would have just ended up in landfill, is an amazing record of Bundaberg, the town, the people, and some of the industries that happened in the town and around the area. So I am so excited to have that book. And yes, I will definitely be looking into the names of those women who were in the dedication and finding out what their connection was if I can, whether they were based in Bundaberg, whether they'd visited Bundaberg or something like that. So thank you so much, James, for finding that book, rescuing it and getting it to me. I really appreciate it. So in the first segment, I mentioned Dr. Charles Ferdinand Marx. Now, he was one of many medical men who actually ran a practice out of his residence. And then when I was researching another building that I'll talk about next, Wickham House, I discovered that it was built by a Dr. Halford. And when I started looking into where he had run his medical practice from, I discovered that in 1906, he began practicing out of his residence at Clayfield, which had been built by the prominent Brisbane architect Robin Dods. I mentioned him earlier as well. He was a stepson of Charles Marx, the doctor. So Robin Dods actually designed a number of grand homes that were also used as medical practices for Brisbane's prominent medical men. This one was called Turrawan, and it was on the corner of Sandgate Road and London Road at Clayfield. It still survives, but it has been shifted around the corner on the block onto London Road, so it's now at 8 London Road. But this house was built as a home and surgery for Dr. Halford in 1906, as I mentioned. And it is a beautiful Federation era grand residence. Now, it is one of the largest and most expensive timber houses that Robin Dods built, and he was building some pretty fancy homes, so you can imagine how impressive it was. And I just thought that that was remarkable, that it captured not only the style of architecture, the work of this remarkable architect, but also the practice of having a surgery run out of your residence. So continuing on from the last segment about Halford's house at Clayfield, where did he go after he stopped practicing out of his house? Well, the trend to have a combined residence and doctor's surgery began to fall out of favour, and as is common now, doctors would have a practice maybe in the central business district or somewhere else, and then they would have their residence in the suburbs separate from their workplace. And this is exactly what Halford did. But he took it to the next level. So he commissioned the construction of Wickham House. Now, many of you in Brisbane may know this building. It's a 6-storey building on the corner of Wickham Terrace and Edward Street, Upper Edward Street. It's next door to the Baptist Tabernacle, and it's across the road from one of my favourite post-war structures in Brisbane, the Wickham Terrace car park. It's a stunning building, and it is absolutely remarkable because it is one of the first buildings to be built as purpose-designed suites for medical specialists. So although Wickham Terrace was a medical precinct from quite early, Dr. Joseph Bancroft was one of the first doctors to have a practice up there from, I think it was 1871, and many other doctors also established themselves along there. By the 1880s, if you look through the post office directories, there is a ton of doctors listed as living and practicing along this street. Now, one of these doctors was S.B. Dods, who I mentioned previously. So he was the stepson of Charles Marx, who had the share in the sugar company. And he was the brother of Robin Dods, the architect, who I mentioned previously when talking about Dr. Halford's home at Clayfield. Many other doctors also established themselves along there. However, most of them were operating out of boarding houses or cottages that had been converted for use as medical rooms. Halford, however, constructed this building specifically to house medical suites, which it remains today, which is quite incredible. And I think it's quite amazing too that Wickham Terrace remains a medical hub in Brisbane. So Halford commissioned Wickham House. It was designed by Francis Richard Hall, and it was so luxurious and ultra modern when it opened. So there's a number of reports in the newspaper and architecture and building journals on the construction, and also descriptions of it after it was open. It also contained a residence for Halford and his family. It was completed by July 1924. Its construction began in 1923 and it took a while. The estimated cost was £25,000. Now that's multi-millions in this day and age, and it was funded by one guy, the Dr. Halford that I mentioned. So quite an amazing risk to take, and he got in just before the Depression struck in the 1930s, so he was very fortunate in that respect. But it still remains as a gorgeous building. It's very little changed inside and out. In the 1960s, an extra level was put on the roof, but that hardly detracts from the building at all. And inside, in the entryway, you can still see there's beautiful marble cladding on the walls and the floors. Unfortunately, the main hallway has been covered over in horrible tiles, but hopefully the marble still remains underneath there. Beautiful timber paneling along the walls, but my favorite feature is the old lift. So this survives in the entry foyer of the building, and it's just fantastic. And the lift was part of why the building would have been considered super modern, but it also had running hot and cold water, which was a luxury most Brisbane houses didn't have in 1924, and certainly not many business premises in Spring Hill had that. It also had some really cool features specifically for servicing the medical rooms, and one of these was an incinerator at basement level, and on each level there was a little balcony and a chute, so you could go out and feed your medical waste into this chute. It would go down into the basement and it would be incinerated, which meant that you didn't need to have a row of horrible rubbish bins out the back in the laneway like many other premises did. I also uncovered, as part of researching Wickham House, that in 1955 it was the site of an absolutely tragic occurrence. A man by the name of Carl Cast was apparently disgruntled about not being able to get any of the surgeons or specialists in the Wickham Terrace medical precinct to sign off saying that he had injured his back so he could get workers' compensation or whatever the equivalent was back then. So he obviously had some mental health issues as well, and he turned up at Wickham House and he shot 3 doctors. He killed 2 of them and badly injured the 3rd one. He also set off a number of pipe bombs in the building, and then he made his way down to Bellow Chambers, which is a few doors down Wickham Terrace, and was constructed only shortly after Wickham House was as well, so it's also an early example of purpose-built medical suites. He made his way down there and also tried to shoot another couple of doctors. Fortunately, he wasn't successful with them, and he then locked himself in an office and took his own life. So a really dark day in the history of both the Wickham Terrace medical precinct and Brisbane in general. And even today, this would be quite shocking, but at the time it was just unheard of for effectively a terrorist event like this to happen. So it just sent shockwaves through the entire country, really. It was reported across Australia. So yes, that was another dark story from our history. I apologise, it's been a bit grim today, hasn't it? But I promise you're going to love the next segment. Okay, so moving on from that grim and tragic story, let's have a look at some pretty photos. When I was researching Wickham House, I was looking for old photographs, and I found some remarkable ones of the site where the building was. There was a boarding house on the block of land before Wickham House was built, which was so cool. I found some photographs of that, and I found some photographs of Wickham House actually under construction, which was really cool as well. But in the process, I also came across hundreds of photographs of Wickham Terrace, and these photographs cover a huge time span, so around about 100 years from around the 1880s to the 1980s, as I mentioned, and they capture, I love Wickham Terrace. I just find it remarkable that from the 1880s all the way through to the present day that it remains a medical hub, and there are buildings from throughout that entire time period that survive to this day. There is just so many incredible buildings on this street, as well as a range of different heritage structures. I'm going to have to do a whole video on that because there's just so much to cover. I'll do a walking tour of it. But this, as a teaser, is some photographs of the street. These photographs capture some of the really early grand residences that were built along the terrace. The street was laid out in 1856, I think it was. I found a plan that actually showed the proposed layout of Wickham Terrace and Gregory Terrace. And shortly after that, grand homes began to be built along the high point on Wickham Terrace. There's also some fantastic photographs that capture not just the street, but The sites below that, so some of you will know Jacob's Ladder, and then the site below that between, what are we talking about, Turbot Street and Ann Street, is that right? Yes, Turbot and Ann. So where Central Station is and this site opposite that used to be the Mincom building, not sure what it's called now, but they capture that, and they also capture a range of buildings that were along with the lower side of Wickham Terrace as well. Now the reason why there's so many great photos, I think, is because the windmill is located on Wickham Terrace, and it provided a perfect vantage point for taking photographs. I won't go into the history of that, but basically it's the oldest surviving structure in Brisbane, and despite being called the windmill, it actually never worked as a windmill. There was never enough wind to power the sails, and eventually convicts manually powered it on a treadmill. But anyway, I digress. There's photographs capturing all this early history, all the way up to some fantastic 1980s ones that capture the cars and the fashion and all that kind of thing. So I hope you enjoy having a trip down memory lane if you knew Brisbane back then, and if you don't, I hope you enjoy seeing just how much the area has changed. I hope you enjoyed part of this fortnight's episode. I know there was a few dark parts in there, but hopefully you found them interesting and you also learned something. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite parts of this video were, or if you've got any reminiscences of visiting doctors on Wickham Terrace or any other connections, and I'll see you next time.